just took the presser foot off just so we can get a better look at the throat plate. So this exercise is looking at sewing 1 4/8 of an inch seam allowance and 1 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and it's practicing using your throat plate. The thing that's hard about this particular machine is that when you have your needle in position 1 with the stitch selector, it's kind of tricky to see some of these numbers. I just want to point them out to you back here. Let's see. So this line right here, that's 1/4 of an inch seam. Okay. 1/4 of an inch seam, 3/8 of an inch, 4/8 of an inch, and then 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, 1 inch. So it gets a little bit tricky when you are using your needle in that position 1 to try to perfectly line it up with this line. Most students have a better chance over here because it's pretty much just lining it with this grid line and then with this grid line. So what I'm suggesting that you do is go ahead and put your stitch on stitch 2. It's still a straight stitch, but it makes the needle in a center position. And I'll show you how to get started on the paper practice. All right, because I had taken my presser foot off earlier, I need to put it back on. Basically, I'm just lining the bar up underneath, and then I'll lower my presser foot. It just grabs a hold of it. Okay, so we're ready to go ahead and do the paper practice now. All right, so I just bought these sewing machines. I did not design them, and so this is gonna seem really complicated. But right now we're sewing a 4/8 seam allowance because I have moved my needle position into position 2 where it's centered. So it's right here, it's centered. Instead of being off to the left, that moved it over by 1/8 of an inch. And so now all my numbers on my throat plate are off by 1/8 of an inch. So even though this box grid right here says that it starts with a 5/8, because I've moved my needle, now it only starts with a 4/8. So when I'm sewing my 4/8 seam allowance, I can just line it up with that box grid right there, okay? So once you have it lined up, you can just drop your needle, drop your presser foot, and then begin sewing and just keeping it lined up with that 5/8 line, but it's actually a 4/8 line. I don't want to confuse you, but that's what we're looking at here. So it's a 5/8 line on the throat plate, but you're actually sewing a 4/8 seam allowance. So I had already gotten this set with a 4/8 seam allowance lined up with my 5/8 grid using a stitch 2. I'm going to stitch forward 3 stitches, and I'll just take my foot off the foot pedal. I'm just doing this nice and slow so you can see it. And once I've gone forward 3 stitches, now I'm going to hit the reverse button, go back 3 stitches, and then I'm going to take my finger off the reverse, and then now I'll put my foot back on the foot pedal and just stitch straight down to the other end. Again, I'm watching the throat plate and I'm keeping it lined up over here just on the outside edge of that grid. So that will keep it lined up with 4/8. Then when I get to the other end here, I'm going to get all the way to the end of the rectangle, and then I'll hit the reverse button again, hold down and watch, do 3 stitches, and then I'll come back to the other end, and then I'm done. So I'll lift my presser foot, and then I'll clip my threads, and the next thing that I'm supposed to do is a 5/8 seam allowance, and that is from the same edge. This is from the folded edge, and so I'm going to line up with the first line that's over here on the throat plate grid. So normally that would be 6/8, but because I have my needle in the center position, it is now the 5/8. So I'll drop my needle, drop my presser foot, I'm gonna stitch forward 3, hit the reverse button, and while I'm reversing, my foot is not on the foot pedal. I just have to put my foot back on the pedal once I begin sewing straight again. So again, I'm just watching over here on this grid line, keeping the edge of the paper lined up. So what you end up with is 2 parallel seams that are 1/8 of an inch apart from each other. I got all the way to the end of the rectangle. I'll hit my reverse for 3 stitches, and then I'm going to sew back to the end, lift my needle, lift my presser foot. I'll clip the threads from both ends, and then you would take out your seam gauge and measure to make sure that you have one that is a 4/8 measure from the edge and another that is 5/8 measure from the edge.